The following took place over about 2.5 months. A bunch of factions have formed, and we decided to have about 5 turns as a sort of tutorial phase to expand the lore of the system and to kind of move things along. None of that content was filmed. However, the following is the summary of what occurred. All of this leads right up to the moment of episode 1. It's been 180 days since the events of the Khan Rider EFN War, also known as the Belt War. Initially, a big push to disarming and vassalizing the Khan was the primary objective. However, it quickly became clear this was not going to happen. The Riders were in a unique position, in a precarious scenario where their military assets far exceeded what their population could support. Initially, with the threat of the looming Khan forces, many had worked for a fraction of a fair price, or even free in some cases. With the threat now gone, CDF, civilians, turned privateers, contractors all up and left, ready to start their life in this new system. The Riders, however, found themselves unable to crew, unable to manage, unable to support, and maintain her large fleets. The simple reality presented itself. Should they continue down this path, it would likely they would implode under the pressure of being such a top-heavy structure. The Riders did not have the population to support the largest navy in system. Thus, for a time, the Riders made a conscious effort to retreat back to her core tiles, mothballing a large percentage of her fleet, and making efforts to lean up her force to a much more concerted, effective, smaller fighting force, and eventually to begin retake the tiles and stabilize the system. Thus, the option of the Riders vassalizing or puppeting, controlling in some manner, the Khans was deemed impractical. EFN was initially put forth as a potential governing body, but as time went on, that also didn't work. The Khans had the largest population density of any faction in the Outer Reach, mostly due to their population residing on a physical planet. In fact, the Khans were the only major faction with a planetary presence, resulting in what one might call an actual civilization. And with civilization comes bureaucracy, infrastructure, and governance. At first, efforts were made to place friendlies, Riders, EFN into positions of power, but with the scale and the Rider struggle that I mentioned rearing its head, the EFN Rider coalition quickly found itself simply replacing Khans with other Khans. Thus, while the Khans were replaced with vaguely pro-EFN Rider-motivated individuals, these were still the same people that less than a year ago were willing to throw the entire population into the meat grinder simply to win a war for the sake of winning a war. The giant shark-sized elephant in the room remained. Had the Khans actually turned a corner, or, when the chips were down, the Riders were looking the other way, the EFN was busy, would they revert to their former ideology? For now, the Khans Enclave was simply renamed the Khans United, a couple pinky promises were made, and that was really all that happened. The Rider EFN coalition, well, much to the Riders' disdain, the Eternity decided their entire focus would be towards building a jump gate to connect to Earth, something the Riders were very strongly opposed to. However, now with 2 wars fought side by side, the Riders simply could only offer token protest. In nature, when a predator becomes extinct, a keystone species displaces, ecological disaster follows, as many that relied on the former arrangement cannot adapt. However, after a period of chaos, very often those that were repressed by the previous order find themselves suddenly without enemies, without competition, and some now find themselves as the top dog, able to thrive in the ruins of the old order. In Outlands, similar occurred. Without the Riders present, without the Khans present, and the CDF obviously being destroyed, new factions began to emerge, slowly at first, and then quickly as the veritable gold rush occurred, as entities went into the place of these large, former now extinct corporate empires. The Winged Tazars was the first of these, formerly a contracting military organization that recently operated for the CDF, and then the Riders now found themselves without clients, without income, with only a small fleet of hardened capital ships meant for large-scale war. From the ashes rises life. In the fall of the CDF and Malta, the CDF enacted Phoenix Initiative, a plan that was quickly whipped up during the course of roughly episode 7, season 2. The plan to keep the continuity of leadership such that the CDF can continue her struggle against the Khans, however in a much leaner fashion. However, in the final hours of the fall of Malta, Admiral Mallard, military high commander of the CDF, contradicted this plan, telling all remaining CDF vessels instead to head to Rider space and continue the war under that banner. However, the Phoenix Initiative still occurred. but with a much smaller fraction of CDF vessels that were not present on Malta. However, their goal remains the same: reclaim Malta, rebuild the CDF, without the burden of the Economic Council. After the fall of Malta, and the CDF as well, most of the civilians actually ended up fleeing the system. However, some stayed behind, unwilling or unable to leave. Some of which fled to the wreck of Malta, which was, while destroyed, had over 20 partially destroyed vessels, five of which were capital-grade vessels. And of course, there was Malta herself, hastily abandoned by both the CDF and the Khans trying to plug their line. Turns out, this makes Malta one of the richest resource points in the system, lots of unsalvaged ships, and in this wreck, the PKM, the Powder Keg Militia, was formed. In Season 2, we see the surface level, the heroes, those that stood their ground against the Khans in their Herculean fight of survival. However, during and after the war, not everyone was interested in this, especially during the war. Many up and left to form their own life, disillusioned by the constant fighting and struggling. One such group was Maxwell Corps, formed by those uninterested in this second war, a struggle that meant nothing to them. Remington, the largest shipyard that was managed by civilians for the entirety of the CDF Rider War, and then the Belt War, loyally toiling away the entire time for their masters to provide the best ships they could to win whatever war was currently occurring. With the Rider retrenchment and the CDF fall, and the Khans being on the other side of the system, this large shipyard, the largest shipyard in fact, found itself alone, without defense, without friends, without allies, and thus for the first time since its creation, in control of its own destiny. With the Outer Reach in the largest period of peace, outside actors begin to look in. The First Fleet, content with letting Outers fight it out, suddenly had all of its wishes answered. All major powers were inert. However, as you've seen, this period only lasted for a short time. New actors and factions were emerging. Unable to let fate right itself, the First Fleet, for the first time in half a century, began mobilizing and forward deploying her fleets into the Outer Reach with Task Force Deliverance. The VPC, the Valkyr Pioneer Company, the largest intersystem corporation and perhaps the richest entity in the entirety of the Pioneer system, deployed alongside the First Fleet. First the carrot, later the stick. The VPC would act as the economic powerhouse, potentially acting in much in the same way the CDF mega corporations did, uniting the Outer Reach under a giant shared goal of profit. And thus the stage was set. An interesting juxtaposition is the tragedy of war. If you do not prepare for war, you will be seized, destroyed, and annihilated. So you must prepare for war, even if you do not want war. In a cruel twist of irony, both the safeguard and enabler of wars is the act of preparing for war, and without a higher governing body, unclear intentions, actions, and motives, the final ingredient, distrust and the advantage of preemptive action, results in humanity always going down the same path. And thus, the stage of the first 2 months of Outlands occurred. Humans seek safety in numbers. Phoenix and Winged Hussars quickly united, both with Phoenix and Winged Hussars having a large number of abundance of warships, specifically capital-grade warships, but lacking purpose and lacking resources. But news travels fast, and Winged Hussars and Phoenix formed an alliance, and, well, people get nervous when they see that. Thus, a secondary alliance formed from the remaining factions. And within a very short period of time, with 2 inconspicuous actions, we enter a bipolar world. For a short moment, both sides were content with minding their own business. But a new paradigm quickly emerged. The Phoenix Winged Hussars coalition possessed a large number of capital ships and vessels as a whole. PKM, VPC, and Remington formed a new coalition aimed to call itself Edo. They formed a large industrial base, since the Outer Reach is much richer. Numerically, roughly speaking, 5 to 8 turns will result in them outpacing the Winged Hussar Phoenix Alliance, who had no way of producing their own ships. The Riders were turning down any involvement, and the Khans were too busy managing EFN things. And thus, the reality set in. One side could win right now, and the other side would win in 8 turns. The only thing preventing war from occurring was one side's trust in the other. One final key remained: The Maxwell Coalition was positioned at as a crossroads. It acted as a buffer preventing war between two emerging coalitions. Maxwell Corps feared Phoenix Initiative, who initially had it out for the former CDF deserters. Thus, the MC cast the final die, and they begin plans that were eventually leaked to the Phoenix Winged Hussars to side with the right side coalition. And with that, the scales quickly began to move towards the right side of the map. Phoenix and Winged Hussars were thus pressured and even forced into attacking due to the balance of power rapidly shifting away from them. In year 2221, December 20th, Phoenix forces pushed into the neutral tile of 1Z, engaging MC forces stationed there. In a 1-2 hammer punch, Winged Hussar forces followed up with a direct strike at the MC capital, destroying them before any allied reinforcements could arrive. And with that, the wheels of war began. The Winged Hussar Phoenixes were afraid of being wiped out from the right side coalition, and now that they had engaged in hostile offensive action, well, all of the fears of the right side of the map were justified, and thus all sides went into a full-blown clash, both believing that this war was a war of survival. And it was. Forces began to converge onto Tile 1B, which was quickly becoming a defensive line for both sides. One final aspect was neglected, however: Remington and the First Fleet. The VPC, the core of the right side alliance, the technological powerhouse, and the leader in a lot of ways, was actually viewed incredibly distrustfully because it was from the inner system. Remington entered into a secret alliance with Winged Hussars, while also being in alliance with the right side of the map. Relationship would eventually form the CPR, a major keystone of the Season 3 story. Remington would provide the economic footing, Winged Hussars would provide the warship and the near-term military prowess. And thus, in one stroke, this bipolar world completely imploded. And Remington attacked VPC from behind, who had no forces on Tile, wiped out their Tile, and destroyed their faction in but a moment. The only remaining asset was the PKM, one of the smaller parts of the Alliance, and they prepared to make their last stand. Ironically, Phoenix, the ally of the Winged Hussars, the one that kind of set all of this in motion, found itself against the wall. Winged Hussars offered them to join their alliance, to form the CPR. However, Phoenix had far different goals that did not align with the CPR, and now suddenly the world existed with Phoenix, the CPR, and the motley PKM crew. Now Phoenix was the only one without production, unable to replenish ships. Phoenix's original goal was to retake the Malta tile, by force if it had to. However, PKM now found themselves as the sole remaining faction of the original Edo alliance, and desperately needed someone on their side, otherwise they were very clearly going to be overrun by the CPR, who were encroaching on their territory and actually fought a skirmish with them. Phoenix found itself ostracized or removed from the Winged Hussar coalition, and their interests drastically diverged, with Phoenix still being a very much pro-civilian organization, and the CPR mainly playing lip service initially, while still attacking a literal civilian organization. PKM represented a civilian organization within Malta, but at the end of the day, they were still civilians. Phoenix wanted to follow in the footsteps of the CDF, but they also wanted their headquarters back. And when interests converge, cooperation occurs. And very quickly, the much larger Phoenix absorbed PKM, creating the Phoenix Coalition. And as this was occurring, the Riders were gearing up to begin redeploying forces. The First Fleet finished staging and were ready to push into the system, and the Khans were just about finishing up the events of Episode 1. And thus, the stage is set for Season 3.